afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to address you firstly, and then also to be on a very panel of very accomplished people and very interesting people. So I'll be very brief about my business. It's a business that we set up around 8 years ago. The original idea was to help people manage technology in homes. An average customer of ours in the US today has 12 devices. We see that amplifying 3 times as you see this phrase being bantered around of Internet of Things, of how that's newer technologies that are ingratiating our lives, whether it's cameras or sensors and so on and so forth. But to step back and more pertinent to the agenda for this panel, and that's looking at building global companies. When we set up the business, the idea at that time, maybe naive, was that we wanted to create a global services brand out of India. There weren't many comparables at that stage. Also, I think when I look back, I don't think the timing was right. I think the idea was naive. You know, we raised a small amount of capital, around 3 million, and we thought we could actually do that. Wasn't possible. So, but we persevered on that goal. And when we looked at globalization from that perspective, it was actually US was the most mature market for technology. That's where large technology adoption was, there was disposable income, so on and so forth. And if I give you some numbers, like 2008 is when we reached 1 billion PCs in use. 54% of them was actually US. That's after 2 decades of consumerization, productization, retail distribution, price points coming down, certain amount of commoditization of technology. That in the next 6 years doubled, and what we see this year itself, we shipped 1.8 billion devices. Those 1.8 billion devices, 64% of those are being shipped from in newer worlds, so it's India, China, Africa, and 70% of those are actually mobile devices. So there's a shift in how the equilibrium of the world is shifting in terms of technology usage, which is creating more nuanced, local ways of how technology is being adopted and deployed. So when we earlier embarked on what we did, and fortuitously we succeeded, which was reached a certain scale, have around 3 million users around the globe, deploy around 5,000 people, created a technology platform that was agnostic and now is agnostic to language. So we have a service center in Spain that delivers in Spanish. We just set up a center in the US. We are expanding to work at home. I have around 1,600 in-panel technicians that do on-site support. So the platform itself gave us that leverage to be able to scale that. And now when we actually look at the future is looking at how technology adoption is going to change further, where there's more devices in home. All of them are working on different protocols. It's not IP-centric anymore. And those challenges actually keep changing. So it keeps us on our toes. But I think coming back to the agenda for this, it's a new world, and we need to look at redefining our strategies for how we address it. Being global in the time that we started was being in the English-speaking markets. I don't think that's really, those are the first markets I would go to today. And I was speaking to one of my panelists earlier, and he was saying, well, China is actually emerging to be one of his biggest markets, and that's a market that we should think about. So when we think global now, I think we need to think opportunistically as we do as entrepreneurs, but also what are the biggest markets of scale. And I think that shift is so rapid that we actually need to reorient ourselves to it, even us as a company, which we think we've actually trying to create a global services brand. So with that, I'll end my session.
Thank you, Vishal. I think this is fantastic. So can we just take Book My Show here? So why don't you go first and talk about, because your meaning of being global is actually very, very different. And you were showing me this video just, which I think blew my mind off. So why don't you talk about what does being global means for Book My Show?
So Book My Show sells tickets for movies, plays, concerts, and events. My parents still think that I black market tickets, so that's who we are. I still can't get them to think otherwise. So for us, look, the way I look at Book My Show is that there is just so much to do in India. While we may think globally in terms of the product and services and the quality of service that we bring to the table, we're only acting locally. So I actually shouldn't be on this panel because we are not a global company. We are very, very local. I still live in the house I was born in. All my schooling, college, education, my office is in a 2-kilometer radius, so I'm certainly not global. Having said that, I think for us, if you look at the scale and size of things, if you look at China, you look at the US and you look at India, the market itself is so large that sometimes you need to look inward than outward. Everybody in India, and these guys have done a phenomenal job, but everybody else and their cousins want to be a global company very, very quickly. I just don't think they solve the problems at home first. Let me give you a perspective. There are 3.6 billion tickets sold for movie tickets annually in India, which is all of Africa, Middle East, Europe, and North America put together. So why should we be a global company? I need to sell a ticket to Warangal. I need to sell a ticket in Aurangabad. I mean, I need to address that same consumer and give him the same experience, even though he doesn't have a credit card, doesn't have a net banking, doesn't have a data connection. He has a mobile phone, but cannot spend 5 rupees a day on a data connection. He's scared about making a payment online. How do I address that guy? I think that's what sort of drives me every day. And if that is being local, so be it. We are local. That's us.
Oh, this is fantastic. I think this is, I mean, he blew my mind off, and I think you should talk about the Bahubali story still after some time. But let's just go to Ajay here. Ajay, I mean, your card says that you're a spiritual, but the first conversation that we were having was about stock crash that happened in New York while you were trading, and you made enough money to buy a Ferrari. And maybe you had to sell it back. So why don't you talk it about?
Yeah. So fortunately enough, what you talked about the idea of entrepreneurship. For me, really started off with philosophy. Right. So being in a completely capitalist society, spent a lot of time in the US, banking and consulting. The biggest learning for me was that what we're trying to do in India, at least 10 years ago, all we were trying to do is sell. Right. It's force consumers. Ashish made a perfect point. India literally has 1/6 of the world population, right? In that, rural India has probably 1/7 of the world population. Now with that population, if you change 1/7 of the world, you literally change the whole world. Now that 1/7 of the population is rural India is actually not connected, and you're trying to make these guys forced consumers. Said in another way, you're trying to sell toothpaste to people who don't have food to eat, right? So for me, the biggest challenge when I saw from a city perspective, every crash, I've been fortunately or unfortunately been a part of the dot-com bust in 2000. I was a part of the 2008 crash, the real estate bust that happened here worldwide. The biggest learning for me was that until you start creating value grassroots up, you are definitely setting yourself up for failure. So I'm talking about solving world hunger, but then that excites me. That's the philosophy that I'm going after. And so the venture that I started, Harva, is essentially about harnessing value of rural India. Eventually the goal was to kind of go global, harnessing value of rural areas. Because if 80% of most of the population across the world is that, then you just harness value by making them producers, and then you can start to sell services, products, which then starts to make sense. So with that thought, we started, or rather I started in city, got 4 or 5 of my friends from different banks, and we launched the first all-women rural BPO in a Jat village with Kha Panchayats in Haryana, right? And that blew people's mind. People said, Haryana, Jat village, Kha Panchayat, all you read in the news is people getting slaughtered, guys getting murdered, women running away with some guy and they were shot by the family. But for me, it didn't make sense at all, right? Because when you talk about money, value creation, we went to these bare bones villages where women were so curious. One example was one woman wanted to work with us, and she'd only studied till 8th grade, never seen a computer in her life. So when I was giving a presentation, she walked up to me and said, I'd like to work on this. Whatever you're doing, it sounds very interesting. So I told her, it's not possible. You've never seen a computer. You've only studied till 8th grade. Aap kaise karoge? So she looked at the computer and she pointed at this keyboard and she said, tell me just one thing. Why does the keyboard read QWERTY? We were taught ABCD in school. This was 5 years ago. Blew my mind. I said, okay, you have me. Why don't you spend as much of time as you want? And she just spent about 4 hours. And I'm not kidding you. And you can check this out on the YouTube. Harva keyboard, that's a video. She came back after 4 hours and she recited the whole keyboard, like QWERTYUIOP, right? blew my mind. And at that point, I knew that this is what could potentially change, make them producers. So we got about 500 of those kind of women, and we started to train them to work on these rural BPOs. And all of them came together, they basically started to produce, right? So from earning nothing and no potential, no outlook for the next 10 years, they started to make about 3,000-4,000 rupees. A couple of girls have even made 12,000-13,000 rupees. That was the making producers part of the economy plan for me. So that's one aspect of Harva, which is Harva XPO, X Process Outsourcing. The second big thing was, after the dot-com crash where I lost a lot of money, basically ended up going to the Himalayas, and big spiritual realization. So from the Rolex watches and mobile pens, I realized that none of that really makes sense. And the way to connect with the people is really to start to appeal to them at a deep down subatomic level, right? And that, I must have traveled about 30 odd countries in the past 2 years. Everyone knows what the swastika is? Yeah? I'm guessing, right? It's a very, it's sort of universal symbol, but it's a dreaded symbol in the West. I mean, you can get jailed in Germany, you can get warned in the US, you can literally get beaten up in Amsterdam. And in India, it's sacred. It's everywhere. It's behind autos, it's behind trucks, it's behind, in temples, jewelry shops, everywhere. So I decided to basically write a book, and that book is called Lost Wisdom of the Swastika. It's going to be released in the next couple of weeks. But related to that now, we're launching a different vertical of Harva, which is Harva Vastra, right? And we started to talk about this, talked about this in Singapore, in the US, and everywhere. And it just appealed to the people that, if you could make something with the handloom industry, with the weavers and basic cotton, and involve the grassroots workers, and you sell it to the bigger economies, then you're literally reversing the trend, and you're creating value here while you're still connecting the rest of the world. So for me, it basically made sense to kind of go global in a very different way. I can get customers, at the same time I can get producers anywhere, right? So I know pretty different from the rest of the people, but that's my story, and happy to share answer any questions as well.
So I think, let's go with Ambrish. I think there is some beauty about this panel which makes it very global yet very local. So Ambrish, why don't you say, I mean, you were, what, 100% business in India just probably a year ago, and now you are fairly global. So why don't you talk about the story?
Yeah, more like 6 months back.
Maybe that's true.
Yeah. So just a little bit about us. I'm the CEO and founder of Nolarity Communications, and came back in 2009 from US to start a company based on a very simple observation that India had gone through telecom revolution and all the consumers had mobile phones. And if the consumers have mobile phones, they are going to call business, and the business are going to receive a barrage of phone calls that they need to be able to handle, which 10 years back, they were not receiving any phone calls. I remember in 2000, we didn't literally have a phone in my home. So I thought every business in India and every single emerging market is going to need a business phone number that they can print on their business card, on their websites, on their marketing material. When the call comes, it can say, welcome to ABC company and all that, right? And that is how Nolarity got started. Right from the beginning, when we started, I think I had a mind set up that we don't want to build just an India company, but an emerging market company. Because I looked at all of the, sitting in New York, I looked at all of the emerging market as a theme of 21st century, where all these economies are going to grow fast. And businesses who do not have technology would want to use technology, and the phone number is going to be the first thing that they would need. So with that vision, we started in India until first 4 years, literally 100% business sitting in India, and close to 12,000 customers now. And in January this year itself, we said, okay, well, enough of India, we need to go out. And we experimented with 12 countries in parallel, started trying to sell in those countries, and out of which I think 4 have worked pretty well in last 6 months, and 2 or 3 I think will work as well. So I think half of them will be successful, or 50% of the bets will turn out to be successful. But in the process, almost 1/3 of our revenue now comes out of India, and I think in next 2-3 months it should be half. Going through this very rapid experience of from Indian company to a company which is a diversified global company and want to offer business phone number to some 50 million SMBs all over emerging markets now.
Fantastic. I think this is it's an incredible journey.